Vado.
Well, good afternoon and welcome everyone. My name is Margherita Vanore and I am a professor in architecture and urban design at the University of Venice. I am very pleased to introduce Mark DeKay from the University of Tennessee, who is just today starting his activity as visiting professor at the University. And I say you welcome, Mark. You have, with the Excellence Department of Architecture and Arts, since 2018, is developing the research infrastructure IRIDE that works for an integral design environment. Here, the PRIDE Lab is developing studies on the modification and innovation of design paradigms in an analytical dimension of complexity and within an integrated vision of project cultures. The field of reflection crosses the different dimensions of living and production of values. A specific attention is given to the crucial factors of urban morphology, landscape, and representation, from territory, public space, up to the human body, and between phenomena, practices, narratives, and representations, even in the relationship between heritage and project. In this context, the issues proposed by Mark DeKay with the integral design and research lectures have a central role. Mark is one of the international protagonists for sustainable design based on an integral approach, both as a theoretical and operational level. Mark DeKay is architect, professor of architecture at the University of Tennessee, author of the book Integral Sustainable Design, Transformative Perspective, and co-author of Sun, Wind, and Light, Architectural Design Strategies. His current scholarship is about designing to experience nature via buildings. And Mark and his wife, that is also his editor, Susan Bennett, were trained by Al Gore as a climate reality leaders and offer lectures internationally on solving the climate crisis by design, along with faculty workshop using the integral research approach. In integral design research lectures, the series of presentation and discussion will introduce a framework for thinking about design and design research at any scale. It is an approach built on the integral theory and developed for architecture in the book Integral Sustainable Design. So thank you, Mark, for your availability to work together in design research for new models and approaches in order to understand better and construct a better future for all of us and for our planet. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Margherita. Can you hear me okay?
Okay.
Very good. Well, welcome everyone. Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for coming. It's a real pleasure to be invited to be here and to speak with you and to be involved in all of these activities over the next couple of months. Every time I do a talk like this, I get to expand and to learn, and I set my intention to make a contribution to each of you. So I want to make a request of each of you listening, that you look for something today, maybe just one thing that could be useful to you in your immediate future. Now, as the people who are involved in the research seminar and the project seminar will soon find out, I really believe that intentions are powerful, especially when beginning a project. So my intention for our time today is to empower your academic life by inspiring you to stretch into taking some new perspectives. My topic today is the integral model, and how it's applied to design. So let's look at what that means. And how I want to start is to tell you a little bit about how I came to this approach and why. I've been in this game of architecture since I started my studies back in 1979. And after a long road, I became an architect here in the United States in 1992. So for about 25 years or so, I was enthusiastically pursuing a technological path to sustainable design. And you can see that here in this example, a sample from my book, Sun, Wind, and Light. And what we were looking at as authors was how to use architectural space and form to influence energy use in buildings. The book has over 100 design strategies, and its tools help designers to make choices, such as this one for combinations of plan organization and section organization to promote good natural ventilation. And of course, there were many quantitative tools for preliminary design. We believe that if we just made simpler, more designer-friendly tools, then of course architects and design students would embrace this way of building that could use vastly less energy. So instead of formulas, we used graphs. We thought, oh, architects are visual. They must like graphs. Well, unfortunately, after all of this time of thinking technologically about this question, how do we design with nature? I had to ask, why was this technological view not being utilized more, not being taken up as it could be by students and by architects? We had some success, but it wasn't driving what people were doing. So I began to see that there were many other approaches that other people were taking about this question of designing with nature. For example, just a few notions here. Instead of just being driven by performance, this famous house called Falling Water by Frank Lloyd Wright focuses on how people experience the relationship of a building with nature. And other architects were interested in the building as an ecosystem, how the building might fit into its ecological context. And then other buildings were relating architecture to nature symbolically. They focused on its meaning. So how could I make sense out of all of this diversity? I was a bit confused, and yet the more I looked at sustainable design, the more diversity of approaches I found. These examples here, widely varying, are all considered by someone as sustainable design. So I wondered, how do I make sense out of this? Low-tech, high-tech, retro, future, all supposedly about sustainability. And these examples too, more divergence. I heard that confusion was a high state, so I must have been in a high state. But I consciously allowed myself to stay there in this state of irresolution, asking questions, and I started making lists like this one of all the different varied approaches to the topic. Now, this was my topic. You might have another one, but the same logics are going to apply. So I ran out of room on this slide. The list could keep going. And sometimes I say to my students that it's a good idea to be immersed in the problem, to swim around in the sea of your topic, that somehow delayed resolution, not solving the problem right away, leads to a better solution. But I had no paradigm that could hold it all, and my brain was hurting, and I needed a map. So about 2002, I discovered the work of Ken Wilbur. He is an independent intellectual, philosopher, author of more than a dozen books, or dozens of books, I should say, and said to be the most translated and widely read philosopher living today. On the left side of the slide here, you see a few of his books, and on the right, some recent books applying that theory to various diverse disciplines. In my work, I began to look at what this integrating view of complexity might have to offer, and in particularly what it might have to offer design and sustainable design. So I was beginning to find a map. Now, the integral model is an imperfect, evolving map. It's not the territory. And having some map, however, is better than having no map. So this was, this image here, for example, is the map of the known world that a geographer named Al-Idrisi put together in the 1100s. And this was at the behest of the Sicilian Empire. So Sicily, you know this, North Africa and southern Italy. So, and I've read that it was the best map around for 300 years or so. So I began to have a little map. And as I began to read these ideas again, I slowly began to make sense out of some of the influences from my own history. This fellow is named Charlie Brown. He was my co-author for the second edition and the third edition of Sun, Wind, and Light. I met him as a graduate student when I was at Oregon. And he was deep into technology and how it could be applied to make buildings more efficient. He was also the leader, one of the leaders in this technological faculty society. And they often thought of themselves as the Lone Rangers, which is a character from an old television show. These solo heroes fighting the good fight. In this case, the good fight was to have buildings use less resources. And Charlie's approach was to look at where performance meets its context in architectural form. And this required something that was a big challenge for me, which was to be able to be proficient in two kinds of languages: the language of performance, more science, and the language of space and form. At Oregon, I also met John Reynolds. Now, he's the author of what in our education system is an infamous technical tome, about 1,500 pages, this mechanical and electrical equipment for buildings. And also, he wrote a delightful book about courtyard buildings. And these indicate John's interest in this relationship between pleasure and performance in architecture. So his answer to this Lone Ranger quest was to address the designer's aesthetic agenda head-on. And this required, again, two different languages: performance and experience or aesthetics. So here I was with my two major mentors looking for a framework that could hold in the same world experience and performance and space. And then I got to know another guy named Levine. And you can see he's a little bit irreverent. He's from the University of Minnesota. And he spoke a language, I don't mean English or Italian, but a language of architecture that was completely foreign to me. And also to most of the Lone Rangers, who by this time sort of thought of themselves more like lightsaber-wielding Jedi warriors from Star Wars. So the technologists called his ideas the dark side. Anything that had to do with poetry, meaning, narrative, all were dark because we were all blind to it. And I realized I had no training in this dark side. It was a fourth language, the language of meaning, interpretation, and symbol. So Lance asked us this powerful question: what if architecture's role were to place people into significant relationships with nature? So now I had these three characters in my early career with four languages and their interlinked approaches, and I was still struggling to resolve it all. And my brain was still hurting. So like all academics do when they can't really solve a problem, you write a book about it. And this book was a bit of a therapy, and it lasted for several years, this therapy process. Integral Sustainable Design, Transformative Perspectives was first published in 2011. And it was the first book to employ the integral model to design. And because climate change and ecological health are my prime concerns, I focused on sustainable design. And back to this theme of intentions, this was my intention in writing the book, to help to create a breakthrough in the effectiveness of the sustainable design movement, such that it is transformed to greater power, relevance, meaning, and positive effect on people and on nature. So I was trying to overcome why was it that the technological only approach wasn't perhaps as effective as I'd like it to be. There's four main parts to this book. Part one examines the four fundamental perspectives of integral theory that we call quadrants, and I'll get to that very soon. The second part investigates levels of complexity for each of those perspectives. And so today's talk is mainly covering these two frameworks. Part three covers a series of mind shifts about how to think ecologically. And part four goes deeply into how we design to connect people to nature from different worldviews. Now, I believe that each major perspective is critical to the ultimate success of sustainable design, or any design really. So again, while I'm showing you my particular topic I was investigating, the frameworks, the concepts of organizing how to look at a problem can apply to anything that you're interested in. Now, one of Wilbur's famous statements is, everyone is right, partially. And another way he says this is, no human brain can be 100% wrong 100% of the time. So everyone, every perspective has something to offer. You just have to figure out what the good parts of it are and what the unworkable parts are. So the first proposition that we have asks, what if successful design required some integration of perspectives from the arts, the sciences, and the humanities? So let's look at this integral model. The integral theory is a powerful mental framework with 5 basic components. We call them quadrants, levels, lines, states, and types. And today we'll just deal with quadrants and levels. In some of the following talks, we'll pick up some of these other issues that deal with lines, states, and types. This little cartoon I like because it explains these 4 perspectives, which are simply the inside and the outside of the individual and the collective. So we have 2 primary distinctions yielding 4 perspectives. Everything on the right side of this diagram is objective. That is, you can see it. It has form and location. It can be measured or weighed or mapped. And everything on the left side is subjective. You can't see it at all. For instance, if I want to know your experience, I have to ask you about it. It's not evident. The upper part is individual and the lower is collective, or singular and plural, if you prefer. And this is how we represented it in the book. These four fundamental perspectives arise from fundamental distinctions that we find in language: first, second, third person, I, we, and it in English. So in the upper right perspective, we call the behaviors perspective, performance is what counts for value. And it tends to use the methods of the basic sciences or engineering. In the lower right, we call that the systems perspective. And what counts for value there is fitness to a context. So we find its methods in the complex sciences, sociology, ecology, etc. In the upper left, or what we call the experiences perspective, of course, what becomes valuable is human experience. And in the university, we tend to find this perspective in the viewpoints and methods of the arts. And finally, the lower left, or cultures perspective, values collective meaning. And that gets explored in approaches from the humanities. So again, this is a simple map, and it's a map of different competing ideas that often seem to be collapsed. But I don't know about your architecture school, but in my architecture school, it's pretty easy to map out the perspectives of different faculty members, and they all think they're right. So let me take you on a short tour of these four perspectives as we consider this topic of sustainable design. So this takes it a little bit more into the details. And in the end, really, what are designers doing? They're shaping form and making decisions about space and form. But why and how that form is shaped is radically different from each of these four viewpoints. So the first is the most common understanding of sustainable design, what we call the perspective of behaviors. And in that terrain, in that perspective, we're shaping form to maximize performance. We're concerned here with how things work and behave in the empirical world. So I call it the perspective of behaviors. In sustainable design, we think of efficiencies and impacts of buildings. And of course, the current holy grail, if you will, is plus energy buildings that produce more energy than they consume. Also, carbon consuming buildings that displace fossil fuels, use renewable energy, sequester carbon, and so on. So for example, this Madrid solar decathlon project is a good example of sustainable design driven by a technological definition of performance. So in this approach, there's really no credits for great experiences of nature and beauty, none for creating ecological order in the larger system, and nothing for placing people into those rich symbolic relationships with nature. So quality and subjectivity are just barely on the horizon. And yet, it's also valuable. This kind of resource efficiency and high performance, the kind of things that this perspective promotes, they're also absolutely necessary, especially if we're going to solve the climate crisis. The behaviors perspective also has its higher levels of complexity. So this is the so-called sliding house by DRMM. And as it's got an outer shell, and as that shell slides, it creates shifting outdoor areas between there's two static elements with a space in between. The lighting conditions change, the sense of enclosure varies, the sunlight and insulation are also varying in a dynamic response to this chaotic climate conditions, but it's a thermodynamic response fundamentally. The second perspective, the perspective of systems, is the home terrain of ecology and all ecological approaches to sustainable design. One of my favorite characters is the landscape architect, John Lyle, and he said that our task is to shape form to guide flow. So what did he mean by these flows? He means the flows of energy, of information, materials, flows of water, and so on, even fish, in a human ecosystem. Here, we can also think about site-responsive architecture and context-responsive architecture, the urban context, the landscape context, and so forth. This is a well-known project by Lyle in California. It's called the Center for Regenerative Studies. It's a live-in educational and research complex where the form and the organization follow the flows of energy and nutrients and waste and water and so on. It grows its own food, processes wastes, heats with solar energy, and so on, very much like a natural ecosystem. The perspective of cultures, this lower left perspective, is the hardest for me. It's the most foreign terrain, you might say, and the one that I struggle with the most, and the one that I have the most fun writing about also. We like to say there that we're shaping form to manifest meaning. So if we have an idea of nature, for instance, we could make a building that would communicate what we think nature is. It's concerned in this perspective with the cultural dialogue that gives rise to shared meaning about design. It holds here all the keys to interpretation. And for sustainable design, this perspective, it helps us become aware of and how to communicate what we believe nature is, and then how to build in response to that idea of nature. And also, really most importantly, back to my friend Levine, he says how to connect humans to nature via design, because we live most of our lives in buildings today, and so that becomes our relatedness, is seen through the frame of the designed world. Each of these projects is an example of something, I think, that is heavy over in that cultural dimension. These are from a competition in Dallas, Texas. And each one is driven by an idea of culture that transcends nature but includes it. Both exemplify this cultural attitude about sustainable development where humans and nature are serving each other in a both-and world. You don't have nature out in the countryside and culture in the city. And both are using technology to do this, but they're driven by this goal of some uniting of culture and nature and celebrating this complex relationship. So this kind of communication, you can never find that in the right-hand quadrants. In the upper right measures of performance, you don't see it. In the lower right ecological fitness, you don't see it, right? Ecological processes could even be hidden. So finally, in the upper left, we have the perspective of experiences where we're shaping form in order to have people have experiences on purpose. And this is familiar to designers. It's also suffered a lot from what I see as a bias against individual subjective perception. I'll give you an example. When I was in architecture school, now this was the 70s and 80s, for 5 years in my undergraduate education, the words beauty and aesthetics were never mentioned. Even today in my design school, which I consider kind of an example of a fragmented, postmodern, pluralist program, almost no one mentions aesthetics or beauty. Yet, thinking from this perspective brings us into the most direct and primary encounter that users have with design. It's how they experience a building. It gives designers the opportunity to create rich human experiences of nature and therefore to establish some subjective personal relationship between individuals and nature, which is the beginning of care. If we are related to something, we can care about it. It's also the home of delight. This little house here by Glenn Murcutt in Australia, the Marie Short House, is very passive. It connects the occupant's experience to the processes on the site and the place. And here's what he says about it. He says, think of the building as an instrument that's picking up all these sounds. So it's addressing the hydrology, it's addressing the geomorphology, it's addressing the topography, the wind patterns, the light patterns, altitude, latitude, the environment all around you, the sun movements. He says it's addressing the summer and the winter and the seasons in between. It's addressing where the trees are. And the trees will tell you about the water table, the soil, and the climatic conditions. So setting up this opportunity for the building as a stage in which we get to experience the details of the site and the place and the climate. So, if the design question then from each perspective is about how are we shaping and organizing form and space, here's one and just one of many possible criteria of good form for sustainable design in each perspective. So in the upper right, behaviors perspective, good form minimizes resource consumption and pollution, make an efficient building, for instance. In the lower right, good form solves for ecological pattern. Remember, we're looking at the system and trying to fit to the context. In the lower left, good form relates inhabitants to nature. It creates a significant, meaningful relationship. And in the upper left, experiences, good form is orchestrating rich experiences of nature. So we could add more to this, but maybe that gives you some notion of these different viewpoints. And of course, architecture is always something that where all of these are present all of the time. So let's try a little thought experiment. So I'd like you to, refresh your posture, get comfortable, right? We like to do little activities. Put everything away, just in case you had your phone on, you can turn that off and put it away. And what I would like you to do is to tune in to your own interior and to notice that in your own awareness, you can take a first-person perspective, I. The perspective of you as an individual with your individual unique thoughts, your feelings, your perceptions, your experiences, and you notice some feelings and thoughts at the moment. Watch those thoughts. You're now in first person. Now, I invite you to shift and take a second person or we perspective. You can notice in your own self that you're a part of a family or an academic discipline or an ethnic group. You are part of this social group attending this lecture. And can you notice then how your individual experience, which is still there, is influenced by the culture that you are situated in? It gives meaning to what you do. Good. Now, I'd like to invite you to shift your attention once more and take a third person perspective. And all you have to do here is just note the phenomena that are in the room where you are. Notice the materials of your seat, the temperature of the air on your skin, the sounds nearby. You are the observer of everything outside yourself. The it perspective, like a scientist. And finally, fourth, I'm going to invite you to shift and take a complex third-person perspective. Become aware of the social networks in your day. Think of some larger system of people or organization that you participate in. Also, it could be the internet that brought you here today. That's a network. Or how you work together with everyone that you're around to wear masks and keep socially distant to benefit everyone. So these four perspectives are fundamental to humans, and they're available to you at any moment. All right, thank you for participating. So sometimes this stuff can seem like it's complex, but at the same time, it's right there for us. This next section is about what I call the four contemporary structures. In integral theory, we like to distinguish between temporary states, things that come and go, and relatively permanent and stable structures. This second major framework in Wilbur's integral operating system, he calls levels. So we could call it stages, levels, structures, all the same thing. So what we mean by levels, though, is fundamentally levels of depth and complexity in a developing system. Here's some characteristics that are common to all developmental systems. Now, there's lots of different disciplines. We could look at lots of different researchers, but here's kind of what they have in common. So higher levels are more complex. They come later in the developmental process, and they're more inclusive than less complex structures. And as the lower diagram here tries to illustrate, what we can see, what we can know and care about is expanding as we're developing. So if you imagine that each level in this little terraced river cross section represents a new level of consciousness, a new level of awareness, then what you can see on the horizon is going to expand. New viewpoints, new vistas come into play. And some things, if you're down at the bottom, never appear on the horizon. You just don't think about them. So in this integral model, each level of complexity can be considered from each of the four perspectives. So we have this unfolding from, in this case, we're calling it traditional, modern, postmodern, and integral. Now, to be rigorous, those are worldviews. They originate from the lower left culture's perspective. But this is a kind of basic map for the content of integral sustainable design, or for really any way that you want to look at a problem. And when these developmental levels are intersected with the four perspectives on sustainable design, it looks something like this. These intersections are what I call the 16 prospects on sustainable design. And Wilbur calls this combination of a quadratic perspective and a level, he calls it a cosmic address. Cosmic with a K, in English at least, as opposed to a C. So because it signifies everything, not just the physical cosmos, but also the world of ideas. So from each of these prospects, or each viewpoint at a cosmic address, different methods are used and different worlds are disclosed. From any viewpoint, some things show up and others don't appear at all. You don't see them. They're occluded. So I've applied this to sustainable design, but the same could be done for any topic. And later on in some of the other lectures, we'll show you how that applies to human inhabitation and how it applies to photography and so forth. So the takeaway here is that each fundamental perspective is unfolding in stages of increasing complexity. And not only does each fundamental perspective unfold in increasing complexity, but it does so in a particular nested way. So this is a graphic that expresses a developmental model on the values line for individuals. So it's an upper left progression of stage-wise development. It's based on a system called spiral dynamics from a guy named Don Beck. You could look that up. He's got a book called Spiral Dynamics. And that's in turn based on the psychological research work of Claire Graves. So each color here represents an emerging stage of development. And the details aren't really important. I like the graphic because it shows things nested. And so that's the general principle, that the stages, they don't ignore the past, they include them. And so when all is going well and healthy, we transcend the disaster of the previous stage and we include its dignities. So we transcend what's unworkable and include what's workable. And the same kind of development is also true for worldviews in the culture's perspective. From each worldview, nature itself occurs as something quite different, but the previous insights are also available to us. So, for instance, and these are 5 levels that I use in the book. It's a simplified system. Some people use 8 levels, some people use 12 levels, depending on who the researcher is, but this is a simplified model. So at level 2 modern, we might say that nature is essentially resource and services, and we're connecting people to nature in that way. It's about how we can benefit from nature. If we go up to level 3 at postmodern, our intention could be to connect people to nature as our community. And inside of that, we still have the resources that we're using, right? That doesn't go away. So this integral model is what I call psychoactive, meaning that it stimulates the mind to find new connections and to construct new and more complex understandings. So with both levels and frameworks, I started to be able to make sense of some of this diversity of sustainable design approaches. Grappling with the lower left culture's perspective in particular was creative and self-expanding for me. So I want to take a look at a few buildings, one from each level of worldview, to illustrate what I'm talking about. Now, the buildings themselves, they're not conscious, they're not embodying consciousness even necessarily. They're an artifact of a particular individual or set of individuals that is operating with a worldview, with a certain lens on things. So we want to look at the idea of nature and the kind of building responses that occur to that idea of nature. So this is a little preview of the 5th lecture in this series, where we'll go into these narratives in much greater detail. At the traditional level, pre-modern, nature is often thought of as either a garden or the wilderness. And in this case, in this desert location, I think it's maybe wilderness. So here we have this idea of a self-sufficient building even though it's a desert, a kind of abundance, right? There's everything there needed for this off-the-grid, self-sufficient shelter. So we're designing to connect people to nature as primal forces and as the structure of what happens here on the planet. Thinking about this from a modern perspective, or the next level up from the mental, nature is the great natural environment. We design to connect to nature as resources and services, like I said earlier. Like we see here in this passively cooled house in Brazil, that creates a range of microclimates, and it uses prefabricated, simple technologies to do that. It essentially becomes a conservation machine that's allowing the breeze and resisting the sun. At the third level, postmodern, pluralist, green, nature is the great web of life. Right? So we didn't have the notion of ecology until the 20th century. So it's pretty far along in the progression. At this stage, we're designing to connect to nature as our community. All the other creatures in the world are part of our community. As we see in this nature center in Texas by Lake Flato, some very good American architects, where regionalist buildings are working together with the natural site to become a connected ecological web. At the fourth level, still here in the culture's perspective, our lower left, integral, we say nature is the great matrix of perspectives. Lots of different ways, but we're going to try and make sense of them together instead of in competition. We like to then design to connect people to nature as this system of complex living systems. Now, Foster's Masdar has gotten some criticism, and whether or not this Masdar city in the UAR will achieve its lofty goals of urban zero carbon, urban zero waste, it'll take us some time, decades maybe, to confirm or deny that. But what's really interesting is, and as an example of a worldview, is this combination of traditional and modern and postmodern ideas and technologies. There's a multi-leveled awareness that's characteristic of the integral perspective. So we have this walled city prototype, traditional narrow streets, courtyards, covered circulation. Those are combined with really smart, intelligent water systems, mass transit, and so forth. So it looks both to the past and to the future for both a cultural expression and a high performance. And then beyond the integral, and many researchers have moved into this direction. I don't do too much with this, but beyond the integral, we can find what we might call the transpersonal levels, or levels. No one knows exactly how far humans get to go in their development. And from this prospect, we might see nature as the great self manifesting. So connecting to that nature is to connect people to their access to the unity of spirit in the world, as we might see, and many people have the experience here in Fay Jones' Thorn Crown Chapel in the Arkansas woods. So I like to think of this, that there may be no greater access to the experience of your expanded self than a deep and real aesthetic response to beauty, which resonates with our souls. And so in all these ways, design can help to connect people to nature. People can be connected at their own level of awareness to their own understanding of nature. And it's incumbent then upon the architect, the landscape architect, the city planner, to become aware of which levels their schemes are operating at. Now, these levels of complexity, just like the quadrants did, they opened up a new direction for me in my existing work with the sun, wind, and light knowledge base. And we used 9 levels in the latest edition, 9 levels of increasing complexity. We have 3 at the scale of building parts, beginning with materials, going up to elements and building systems. We have 3 at the scale of buildings, beginning with rooms and ending with the whole building. And then 3 scales or levels of complexity at the scale of building groups or sites, ending up with neighborhoods. And of course, you could keep going up in scale and complexity. And for design, these levels are nested and they have increasing scale. So again, in the lower right systems quadrant now we're talking, we have the idea of levels of complexity. Here is just one example from more recent work with sun, wind, and light. It's one example of many strategies for daylighting, one from each level of complexity. So this is not just a theoretical construct. Each lower level actually helps to build something higher at the next level up, and the next level helps to organize the lower ones. And if you were to pull out one of these at any level, particularly the lower ones, then the whole house of cards, the daylighted building, it just simply doesn't work. So each level of a design idea is linked to the next, and it's necessary. So here's a representation of that as a knowledge base. Each icon represents a design strategy from the 3rd edition of Sun, Wind, and Light. That's from circa 2014. These are then combined with what I call this design strategy map. It shows the nested hierarchical relationships across 9 levels of scale and complexity, from neighborhoods to materials. And the lines represent relationships among the strategies. What I discovered in working with my students in mapping this was that there seemed to be families of related strategies that could be used to solve recurring problems. I call these strategy bundles. And together with Suzanne, we made a collaborative learning game that we call Bundle Up, based on this idea. But notice that this map of complexity is not really developmental. So I want to add one more distinction. And that is, let me say that what I've shown you, if I'm to be more rigorous, is levels of spatial complexity. And these are a product. They're an artifact of a way of thinking, which is somewhere in the integral territory. That is, so there's an upper left interior thought expressed as a lower right map of the design world. So in the lower right, if we look at how different worldviews see the systems perspective, then there's also an unfolding, a development with a vector. So here are 4 levels. I'm saying that map I just showed you, I think, is kind of early level 4. And again, each level has its value to contribute. And so more complex levels build on the less complex. Each has its strengths and its limitations. At the traditional or pre-modern level, systems are tacit. They're embedded. There's actually no such thing as a system at the pre-modern level. There's no understanding of networks or ecology, for instance. But it's workable, it's local, it's ethnocentric knowledge, it's embedded in the ways of the building community. At the modern level, systems are logical, linear, like parts in a machine. Interchangeable parts is the system logic of industrialization. At the 3rd level, postmodern, the systems are complex. We place everything into a context and link the parts together in cycles, and yet sometimes it's still a bit of a collage. And finally, at the integral level, the systems are living. We can talk about living systems or integrated human and natural ecosystems. They're multi-leveled, nested, networked, ecological, and so forth. So we have all these perspectives, worldviews, levels of complexity, prospects. It can get complicated. So could we then simplify? Could we what would be an integral approach if we just boiled it down into one overarching idea or principle? So here's my attempt. Design by considering multiple levels of developing complexity in the intersecting domains of self, culture, and nature. So that's like saying, add the developmental levels to each quadratic perspective. One more time. Design by considering multiple levels of developing complexity in the intersecting domains of self, culture, and nature. So self, I, upper left, culture, we, lower left. Nature, the right side, objective quadrants. So integral thought has opened up many, many questions for me and many new collaborations. It allows me to work with people around the world who are dedicated to pursuing ideas and problems that alone we cannot accomplish. And in this process, we get to make a difference in each other's ability to make a difference in the world. In this lecture series, I'll be sharing some of these collaborations with you. So next up in the series here is Astrid Rotzel from Australia. And she and I will be talking about applications of the integral model as a framework for research questions and methods. I hope you'll come back for that one. Deacon is actually uses something they call the integral design futures to structure the research within their department. On the 29th of March, I'm joined by Suzanne Bennett, my editor, my co-lecturer, and workshop facilitator for many years, and we're also married. We'll be sharing our approach to speaking internationally on the topic of solving the climate crisis by design. And of course, we use an integral substructure for how to organize those questions. Then on April 12th, I will be happy to share the stage again with the talented Greek architect and architectural photographer Pygmalion Karatsas. We use an integral approach to study and practice and teach about photography, architectural and landscape photography mostly. So don't miss it. The visuals, I'll promise you, are going to be amazing. And finally, our fifth and final public lecture will be with Melanie Watchman. She'll be joining me from Laval in Quebec in Canada. And we'll be sharing both about the narratives of connecting to nature that I briefly introduced you to today, and some new integrally informed work on biophilic design. That's part of her doctoral work. So the subtitle of the Integral Sustainable Design book is Transformative Perspectives. And in taking these perspectives repeatedly over and over as a practice, the potential of transformation exists for each of us. And by transformation, I mean the way the world occurs for you is expanded. And to expand our world space is really the most significant kind of self-education. And I want to suggest to you that the great design questions of our time are all great collective projects. Climate change, housing for the poor, solving urban sprawl, and so on. Of course, to work at this work alone is to fail. However, working with multiple perspectives allows the kind of integration that can create emergent solutions. And we'll talk about that next time. Such emergent solutions are more complex and more effective than when you use just a single perspective. So the integral model is then also a powerful tool for interdisciplinary, team-based design and research communication. So I will end with the idea that the integral model is not a paradigm. It's rather a cognitive practice or a set of perspective-taking tools to enact and to gain access to an integral awareness. It's something that you can keep doing over and over for a long, long time and never quite get there. I invite you, however, to come back for our next lecture, which will be in 2 weeks, on the integral approach to design research. And in the 2 weeks in between, you have some homework. I'm going to invite you to practice taking the 4 perspectives every day. Just practice shifting like we did earlier. And if you'd like an advanced challenge, to also practice identifying whatever you're doing, speaking, writing about, what is the cosmic address that you are inhabiting, that combination of a perspective in a quadrant and a level. All right, well, thank you so much for your kind attention. And now we'd like to turn this monologue into what I hope is a wonderful conversation. Thank you again for having me, and thank you for being here.
Thank you, Mark. Everything very interesting, and I would like to ask to the participants if there is some questions. Please, if you want to raise hand. No one question.
Be shy. This format should allow us to have lots of participation and engagement.
The participants, I look that there are many colleagues, and so if they want to make some question, it's welcome. Okay, I try to understand better something that is about the differences between the right side and left side of the four quadrants that are for us always the principal references or integral approach. I give you the
well, the simple answer really is that the right side is the objective world. It's the empirical world. We use the methods of the simple and the complex sciences. So in architecture, for example, we have thermodynamics, heat loss, heat gain, the movement of the sun, the discipline of studying the building structure and its materials and how they behave in response to various forces. We also have the larger picture. How do those pieces fit into a larger system? So that's our lower right complex approach. And so, for example, if we look for important patterns on a street or in a neighborhood, and then the building gets designed in response to that context, we have taken a system's lower right perspective. Right? On the other hand, the left-hand perspectives are the interiors of human beings. So if we're just drawing and mapping and measuring, none of that includes my own or your experiences, your feelings, your thoughts. Also, in the lower left perspective, we want to know, what does it all mean? Right? And that's the territory of theory, for instance. And in order to do that, we have to have conversations. Right? So the left-hand perspectives are subjective, and they can be individual for one person, or they can be for a group. Any group will do. And those are the fundamental distinctions.
Very well. So, are there any questions?
So one of the first things to ask is, what is my own home territory? Where am I the most comfortable? Where do I resonate? Right? So for me, you can tell a little bit from my story there. I began with the upper right behaviors perspective about the science of building. And then at some point I said, oh, that's too reductionistic. Let me expand to become an ecological thinker, a holistic systems thinker about buildings. And then I thought I had it all figured out, right? So that's my home territory. I resonate there. But then I recognize that there's some big problems with that, particularly from the environmental perspective, because many people don't think that way. If a person is oriented towards thinking as their home resonant territory in the subjective, let's say an artistic perspective, or a phenomenologist, then no amount of charts and graphs about climate change is going to explain that and convince them. It has to be from the point of view where their listening resides. So other people I know, my historian friends, for instance, they clearly resonate in the culture's perspective. And everything becomes, how do I understand the world through understanding its cultural context, or in having dialogues culturally about what things mean. So each one of these perspectives is present right here, right now, in this virtual room even. And certainly about when we look at anything in the landscape or anything to do with buildings.
Well, but when do you understand the necessity of an integral approach in your life of as architect?
Well, I understand it as perhaps necessary all the time. That imagine that architecture is something where if you leave out one of these perspectives, you don't really have a building. So they're all there. We just are usually, as a human being, we're better at some things than others. And so it's important to be aware of the things we're not so good at. So, for instance, on the left side is all about the people and the culture. If you take the people away, you may have a warehouse, a storage shed maybe, but you've got no architecture. Right? If you take away its context or its site, that is the lower right systems perspective, you may have a piece of art that you can carry around, but maybe not a building. So they're all present and they're all necessary. And what we have to do really in the design schools, at least in my experience, is to begin to appreciate the truth and the value that each perspective offers. Each one has something to say to us. For instance, we can make the best, most efficient green building that uses no energy, but it could be a terrible place to inhabit because we haven't thought enough about the individual experiential approach.
Okay.
Did we have a question here? Yeah. No. You'll have to translate.
No, it is not so in time. Thank you, Professor DeKay. Is Marco Capponi. A question, where could we place the concept of identity? Maybe in the perspective of cultures?
Well, I would say yes and no, because who is it that has an identity? So the individual has the identity. I identify as an American. I identify as a man, and so on. That's me. But if I was not living in an American culture, I would not identify as an American. Right? So our sense of identity and the definition of that is a conversation between the individual and the collective.
So, into
if you apply that to architecture, then it gets a bit more complex, because we could say that we might identify with a place. How do we identify with the place? Part of that is that there is a building tradition in that place. And that building tradition is a cultural product, but it's also a product of what materials were available, the climate of the place, the way in which people in the building community over time have created the built environment. So we can identify with a cultural artifact, but that cultural artifact has been produced as a result of the physical forces, the topography and the culture itself. So identity, if you think about it, as an experience, it's in the upper left perspective. But the question is actually an all-quadrant question, and those arise simultaneously.
Thank you. Another question. Daniela Ruggeri. Dear Mark, thank you very much. I have a question. Multiple perspectives can bring to multiple possibility of design. But as an architect, we have to choose one. How to choose at the end one design project between multiple possibilities?
Well, that's an interesting question. So I think what you're asking is about the choosing of a particular approach or methodology for architecture. And
I'm sure that's what she's
asking. Is that the question? Is that the intent? That is, it's about how to do the project, which approach to choose.
Can we talk to her?
Sorry, perhaps we can also make Daniela.
Yes.
Yes. Let's hear from Daniela.
Yes. Okay. Thank you very much. I wanted to ask not about the approach, because if the approach is an integral approach, I have many possibilities to design a project. But at the end, as architect, sometimes we are requested to then give one answer to a problem, let's say, how we choose then the right one when we have then with a multiple perspective at the end. Yes. we can have many we can have many answers, how to choose the best one.
Yes. Well, so one way to answer that is to say, what is the question that's being asked? And oftentimes the question itself arises from a particular perspective. So next time we'll talk about the integral approach to research, and we could say there might be an overarching question for the research, but there could also be an individual question in each quadrant, a research question. In a design environment, you might have a question from the client and a question from the contractor. They would have different questions that would need different methods and different answers, right? So that's one way, is to say, identify the perspective from which the question arises and use a method to answer the question which is appropriate to that perspective. Another viewpoint we like to call integrally informed work. That is to say, we become aware of the multiple approaches and the multiple answers to your question. And In the context of the question, we choose. So it doesn't mean that we have to always use every perspective. So for instance, in the Integral Sustainable Design book, we have 16 perspectives. We could have had 20 or 30, many are possible. I don't want to design a project with 16 different perspectives, right? But I have to be aware that those exist and make sure that I'm not leaving out something important. And we'll show you an example next time from a research project where in the rigorous methodology, there are 8 fundamental approaches, and we chose 4. And out of those 4, we've really developed 3 to a higher level and 1 not so much yet. So I hope that helps.
Thank you very much. Very clear. Thank you.
Thank you. Good question.
The question about the changeability of this quadrant approach, this all quadrant approach. How much is it changeable and flexible for the different problems of complexity?
Well, I look at it like it's a matrix, right? There's a matrix of possibilities, and we have to integrate those. So there is always flexibility to choose your emphasis and also to look at the time and the money and the expertise. So, for example, you might want to know something for which no one on your team has the expertise. So this time, maybe we can't answer that question. But we know it's there. And if we had the resources, we might try to answer it.
Okay, we'll try.
So I think it's much harder for one person. I talked about, with my history with mentors, that they had different languages of architecture, and I was trying to master all of those and bring them together. If you have a complex project, like many of the research projects in your university, they're complex, thorny, difficult problems, big scales, would be very difficult to have one person employ multiple methodologies to research that question. You might need a team. Right? In the same way that when we make a building, we always need a team.
Always.
Unless it's a very small building in my own house.
We are on teams. So, okay. Anything else from the participants? Okay. At this moment, I think that many questions are open about our works and also for our approach in designing, because we have to also to understand what is the question, the issues from the contemporary situation. And in this contemporary emergency, we need to have a different approach in everything, and especially in design, in designing our future, and in designing also the future of our habitat, our planet. Many proposed perspectives are in this moment over the plate, and we are trying to understand better how the complexity of this moment may give us a new path, a new process of understanding the reality, and also to change this condition for a better future. I think that integral approach is very important to understand better the different perspectives, but it is also very difficult to understand how architecture can make this approach real productive and effective. So I think that the work is very difficult, and perhaps working together we can try a better path in research as in the design. Thank you, Mark, very much. This is the first of 5 lectures, but we are waiting for the next one. And now I think that we can help our researcher with a new perspective for the future. Thank you. Goodbye, everyone. Thank you to all the participants.
Thank you so much.
Bye. Bye. See you the next Monday, no? 15th?
Wednesday, the 10th.
The 10th. Okay. Thank you. Goodbye.
Ciao.
Ciao. Ciao a tutti.
Goodbye.